Welcome to Starter TV. I'm Jennifer Crumpton. Today I'm talking with William Green. He's the author of The Great Minds of Investing. He's the former editor of the international editions of Time magazine, and he's written for multiple business magazines such as Forbes, Fortune, and The Economist. William, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
You have a really fascinating background. Tell us a little bit about your career journey.
Sure, it's been a long and winding road. I really knew from the age of about 9 that I wanted to be a writer, and so I went to Oxford to study English literature, and then when I graduated, I was still pretty young, I was about 20, and I decided that I would try to write about literature and great ideas, and so I wrote an article that I sent off to 5 different magazines about the relationship between 2 famous writers, Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Ford. And I get back this buff-colored envelope with a copy of the Spectator magazine with my article in it and a check for £70. And I thought, wow, this is it. You know, I've made $100 or something like that for a week's work. And so that kind of started my career. And then, much to my surprise, having decided that I would be this very literary writer and would probably become a legendary novelist, discovered actually that I fell in love with business and investing, which was a total surprise. And so I moved to New York in my early 20s. I went to Columbia Journalism School to do a master's degree in journalism. And I suddenly found myself becoming increasingly obsessed with covering business and the stock market. Partly because the stock market is just a fascinating game. You know, it's one of these areas where by using your intelligence you can kind of outwit other people. So I was fascinated in that aspect of it, much as I've been fascinated by horse racing as a teenager. And then, you know, there's so much sort of ego and power and ambition in the world of business. And so I started to think, well, wow, this is an incredible story. So I started writing about business for magazines like Forbes and Fortune and the like. And then, sort of much to my surprise, I ended up getting a job in Hong Kong as the deputy editor of the Asian edition of Time. I'd never even been to Asia before. Wow. And then after a while, I got promoted, so I became the Asia editor of the magazine. And so I had this incredible job where I was overseeing these wonderful reporters, writers, and stringers around, you know, China, India, Korea, Pakistan, all of these extraordinarily interesting regions. Then I got a job editing the European, Middle Eastern, and African editions of Time. So I moved to London, spent a few years there, spent some time at Bloomberg as an editor-at-large, which gave me the opportunity to report in places like Saudi Arabia and Russia. And then about 5 years ago, I made another total shift and became a writer of books. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, I've written 3 books. So I would say the common denominator has been that nothing has ever stayed constant. I've had constant change over the last 20, 25 years. And the other thing I would say that's been constant has been that I've always failed to predict what I would do next. At every stage of the game, my career sort of took an unexpected turn. So I've just totally given up on predicting what will be next at this point.
You know, and it's funny because career planning, you know, so many experts will talk about how you need to be envisioning your goals for 5 years, you know, but clearly
I don't think you can. I mean, it seems to me, I talk to my kids a lot about this because I have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old, and the kind of careers that we thought would exist don't really exist anymore. And so I often say to them that I think the most important thing is to develop skills, because if, you know, for example, if you learn a couple of languages, if you become totally fluent, or if you become an extraordinary writer or public speaker or whatever it might be, you know, it'll stand you in good stead at some point. Because what I've found over the last 10, 20 years is the industry of journalism is just so totally different. How could you predict that you would need particular skills?
Well, and your career took such leaps and bounds throughout this journey that you've had. How do you think you've been so successful?
It's kind of you to say. I like your description of my career. I think one of the biggest things that I've done is I've taken real risks over and over again. And so when I was 21, I moved to New York. I didn't have a job. I didn't have. I didn't really have any set idea of how I would make a living. But I had a sense that if I wrote for English magazines about America, there was a market there, and so it was a kind of target-rich area. Then again, I moved to Hong Kong later, having never been to Asia. That again was very risky, and I had 2 young kids and a wife that I was dragging along with no real idea of whether it would work out. And then a few years ago, giving up pretty steady, decently paid job at a big news organization to go write books when I had 2 kids in private school again, was possibly foolhardy and reckless. But I think it gave me tremendous opportunities that I was prepared to pick everything up and say, you know, I'm getting a bit bored, I'm getting a bit restless. What would be exciting and fun now? And so I think that willingness to change, regardless of what you're doing, is very powerful. And then the other thing I would say is just sheer persistence, because, you know, I've had so many failures along the way where you would think that a project would work out, or you'd think that a particular job would work out and it wouldn't, or you know, the writing business is very bruising, and so you would write a story that you'd spend weeks on and then it would get killed, or it would get butchered by an editor, because writers always think their editors butcher their prose. And so, you know, I think as in any profession, you have to kind of pick yourself up after these very bruising experiences and say, well, you know, wow, that really hurt, and I'm going to keep going anyway. And I see that with a lot of the famous people I've interviewed over the years, that they just have this kind of dogged perseverance, that they still go through tremendous adversity and setbacks, but they don't give up in the way that I think most people do. A friend of mine at one point said to me that in his experience, people always quit right before the miracle. And you know, he was someone who was sort of freeing trafficked women, and he, you know, I talked to him when he was in tremendous danger and had gone into hiding, and the next thing I knew, he'd gone back to exactly the same place that he'd been in when he'd been in tremendous danger.
That process of being able to learn from failure, that fearlessness or that resiliency, do you think it's something that people are born with, or did you develop it, or?
It's a great question. I think some people definitely have a bigger capacity to deal with failure and setbacks and the like, and I think you can develop it. Philosophically, you can look back at your life and say, you know, I failed at that and it wasn't the end of the world. It didn't destroy me. And I think when you've been through enough failures and you've bounced back from them, you sort of say, you know what, I think I'm going to be okay at this point. And I've often felt, looking back on my life, that I'd sort of gone from failure to failure, and yet somehow the trajectory was upwards, you know, because this is just the way your life goes, right? It's like this. It's not a straight upward trajectory. And so I think that mindset is very important, but it grows partly out of the experience of realizing that you survived even though you were bruised.
So what role have mentors played in your career? Have you had many? Who have some of them been?
One of the most interesting people who I would say became a mentor to me, but who probably wouldn't recognize the description of himself as a mentor, is a guy called Nasser David Khalili, who's a legendary art collector. He's possibly the greatest art collector of our time. And when I left the magazine business a few years ago, a sort of formal, steady job in the magazine business, to work on books, the first thing I did was to work on his autobiography with him. And he's an absolutely extraordinary man who had left Iran in the 1960s with $750 and is now a multi-billionaire. He has 25,000 works of art, including the greatest private collection of Islamic art in the world. He's Jewish and yet has this extraordinary Islamic art collection. He's also been knighted by 2 popes, and he uses his art to bring unity between different faiths and creeds and different nationalities. And one of the things that I saw him working very, very closely with David Khalili was that he had absolutely no sense of limitation. I've never seen anything like it. He felt that everything was possible. And so as a 14-year-old in Iran, he had actually written a best-selling book about, you know, 220 geniuses throughout history. And so that was very inspiring, to work up close with someone who, you know, really didn't feel that anything was impossible. I found a very inspiring idea, because so much of the time we're kind of held back by our fears and our doubts, and, you know, a lot of it is kind of constructed in our own minds. It's not real. And so he made me think, you know, do I really want to live that way? Do I want to live so fearfully, or should I try to mimic a little bit of his mindset?
What advice do you give people, young people in particular, who want to rise to the top in today's business world?
I think all of us are basically given very unique talents and gifts, and one of the biggest questions that you have to ask, whether you're, you know, 17 years old or 45 years old, is what on earth am I supposed to do with these talents that I have? How am I supposed to have an impact in the world? What can I do where I harness these capabilities, whether it's as a TV interviewer or as a writer or as a businessman, as a salesman, whatever. How do you harness that to have some beneficial impact in the world? And I think if you have that kind of broader mission, if it's not just about your own ego and your, how much money you make and whether you can pay the mortgage and all of that, I think that helps a great deal. I interviewed someone recently who's a billionaire investor who said to me that one of the qualities he looks for in the people he hires is actually generosity, because he said if it's really just about the money, then at some point their sense of drive and discipline kind of dissipates, and so you have to have something beyond you where you're a little more philanthropic, or you want to use your talent somehow to help other people. And the other thing I would say is there's tremendous pressure to conform and to do what other people expect of you, and I think it's really important to be true to yourself, to figure out, what actually will make me happy, what will give me satisfaction, what will make me proud. And I think there's a tremendous pressure to make a living, and we all have to do this, and we need to support our families and the like. But I think you can very easily get stuck in a profession that you don't like, that doesn't give you joy at all. And on the whole, you're not going to be very successful if you're doing something that doesn't give you pleasure. So I think to have the strength of mind to sort of look inwards and say, am I being true to myself? And if I'm not, maybe it's time to make a change. I think those are very important kind of filters for how to look at one's career.
You have interviewed some of the greatest leaders in the world. What makes a great leader?
One of the things that comes to mind to me is simply a sense of decency and integrity. I was thinking back recently to a letter I'd written to one of my former bosses, a guy called Bob Safian, who's now the editor of Fast Company magazine. And I wrote to him a few years ago and just said, you really were the best boss I ever had, and I just wanted you to know that. And the reason was really that he was an incredibly decent bloke, and continues to be an incredibly decent bloke. And as a result, he drew this group of incredibly talented people around him. And so I would say, you often feel that in the business world you have to be kind of tough and ruthless and the like. But actually, to some, and you do have to make difficult decisions. You can't just be a softie. But to some degree, it's a real competitive advantage if you have a reputation for being kind and decent and treating your employees, with respect and human dignity and the like. And if you look at someone like Warren Buffett, who's built Berkshire Hathaway into one of the most successful companies of all time, he emphasizes values like trust and integrity and honesty. He tends to be very slow to lay people off. And, a few years ago he was saying in a speech that when he thinks of Charlie Munger, his partner, he said, looking back over 40-something years, he's never seen Charlie take advantage of anybody. That's an extraordinary thing to be able to say about someone that you work with or work for, because that becomes a tremendous reputational advantage. If you're known as somebody who treats your employers and your colleagues decently, and also your partners, then you're likely to draw high-quality people around you. And so I think part of what's interesting about people like Buffett is that they've shown that you can actually behave in kind of an enlightened way within the capitalist world and be astonishingly successful. And so the fact that he's become one of the 2 or 3 richest men in the world while acting decently and honorably, I think is it's quite inspiring, and I think it's a good model for a lot of us, even if we're not expecting to become quite as wealthy as Warren.
Journalism, as you were alluding to earlier, has changed incredibly. It changes almost as fast as technology does these days, partly because of technology. Where do you see it going? What are the pros and cons of all these changes?
Yeah, journalism really, ever since I left Columbia Journalism School probably 20 years ago, everyone's always been saying journalism's dying. It's never been an easy period to be a journalist. Yeah. I think it's just one of those professions. And we all know that there's a tremendous shift towards free content, that more and more people expect content to be free. It's a difficult business economically. The old model of advertising has kind of largely collapsed and disintegrated. then again, I still think there's a tremendous desire for high-quality content, and you see it in every area, whether it's books and publishing, whether it's magazines, newspapers, online. And I'm struck by the fact that publications like The Economist, The New Yorker, The New York Times continue to do extraordinarily good journalism and continue to have a devoted following. So I find that kind of heartening. Then at the same time, you know, I had a fascinating experience recently where I wrote a story for LinkedIn about Buffett that got viewed by the best part of 300,000 people. And that was an astonishing revelation to me, just the sheer power of these new media tools that didn't really exist 10 years ago. So the ability to get stories out is kind of greater than ever. Then on the other hand, I didn't get paid to spend several days writing the piece for LinkedIn. So there's this conundrum that you have this tremendous ability to get your work out there and your ideas out there, but actually to get compensated for it becomes a conundrum. You know, you have to, as a journalist, start thinking about your brand, which was a horrible idea that I never would have taken seriously in the past. But actually, you can no longer afford just to hide at magazines like Time and The Economist and say this stuff's irrelevant. So I think there's tremendous disruption, which has created extraordinary opportunity. But it would be kind of scary for a lot of people. How do I actually harness social media? And then at the same time, I think you know, still you have to have this tremendous emphasis on producing high quality work. So the reporting still has to be reliable. You still have to express opinions that are useful to people, because otherwise, how do you rise above the noise? Nobody needs more sort of repurposed mulch, you know.
Yeah, and that makes me wonder, with the 2016 election cycle coming up, and opinions and partisan journalism and sensationalism, that type of journalistic branding, we're for just the conservative people, or we're just, where is that going?
It's a great question. I don't know. I find myself drawn to particular outlets within the journalism world. So I basically have a sense that the New York Times is trying to be fair and is trying to be good. I know other people might disagree and make out it's a liberal rag and the like. I think they're very responsible, and they really do good work. Likewise, if I'm reading Time, I think someone like Joe Klein is terrific, who covers politics. So I think there are still people have integrity and are smart and are decent. And you know, it seems to me that there's so much noise out there that there's still a tremendous role for the people who are kind of trusted voices within the noise. And you know, nobody really needs more noise. I think increasingly you see publications like The Economist that have consistently invested in good coverage. They haven't kind of chipped away at their page count. So it's still a pretty fat magazine. It's still, you know, it still offers good value to their readers. I think that, you know, readers feel that kind of good faith effort to tell the truth, whether, you know, and to offer interesting perspectives and views, whether you agree with those views or not. I think that commitment to a sort of honest debate is more powerful and important than ever.
Do you think readers are changing? Do you think readers or viewers are looking more for hearing their own beliefs sort of regurgitated, or?
I think the market is so fragmented. So one of the beautiful things about being a writer or a journalist in America is the market is just huge, and so there's a market for highly intelligent, thoughtful writing. There's a market for, you know, regurgitated cat videos as well, and you know, that's fine. I mean, you know, we all need to watch cat videos once in a while, no doubt.
For our health.
Yeah, but I don't think that world of high quality news is dead by any means. I just think the challenge of paying for it is great, and so the people who value it, the audience that actually values it, needs to pay up. They need to subscribe. But I think there are plenty of people who are actually willing to do that. What
is the most surprising story or memorable story that you've ever covered in business?
I've covered so many strange stories. One of the most fun was a piece that I did for the Talk of the Town section of The New Yorker many years ago, where I had written a story about a guy who had killed his show horse for the insurance money. and he was an enormously rich guy and ended up going to jail for it. And in the process of reporting that, I interviewed this private investigator who said to me, "I've got a much better story for you than that." And he told me about some guys who'd been killing show cows for the insurance money.
Oh my goodness.
And so I went to this crazy private investigator in some little hotel room in New Jersey where he had his guns and his pork and beans cans and stuff like that all scattered around the room, and his telescope and stuff. And he starts telling me about this extraordinary story where he'd been investigating these two guys who had been allegedly killing their show horses for insurance money, and one of them was like a champion breeder of show cows, and one of them was a show cow judge. And he had called them at one point, and he said, without much evidence, he said, "I'm on to you." And within 24 hours, both of them committed suicide. And this was just such a bizarre story. It felt like I was in a Coen Brothers movie. And so I would say that was one of the single strangest experiences. I'm not sure it had any elevated, higher meaning to it, but it was just an incredible story.
It's so interesting because really you think about that type of corruption in much more high stakes sort of businesses, maybe technology or,
but apparently these show cows could be worth $250,000. And one of the things, I mean, it was bizarre. The whole thing was kind of comic and ridiculous and tragic at the same time. So this private investigator said to me the telltale clue for him was that the cow in question needed an udder halter. And he said to me, "These cows are supposed to be like Marilyn Monroe. It shouldn't have needed an udder halter." And so he said that was the thing that tipped him off, that there was something wrong, and that led him to sort of question these two guys. So it really was like a Coen Brothers movie.
So you recently worked with Guy Spier on his memoir. What did you learn from that process?
Guy actually became a great friend during the process, and so part of what I learned was from sitting around with him endlessly over cups of cappuccino in his house in Zurich, talking about life and the universe. And one of the things that really struck me about Guy is he has this very strong belief in what he describes as the compounding of goodwill. And we often talk about compounding money, right? If you invest for a long time, your money in stocks and the like compound, make you enormously rich. Guy's view is that there's this much more profound and important type of compounding of goodwill where he really takes this seriously. And so he's created this incredible web of goodwill by just acting kindly to people. And he's done an enormous number of acts of kindness to people. My son is at Harvard Summer School at the moment because Guy sent him there and sponsored him to go. And so it's very deeply sincere. And the paradox that I think Guy discovered, which I think is very profound, is that when you start focusing more on other people, helping other people, you actually become happier yourself. And so he said he kind of started acting that way sort of cynically because he thought it would help him in life and he'd become more professionally successful because, people would feel good about him. And then he said he became kind of addicted to the good feelings that it aroused in him because he just really enjoyed helping people. And so it's really become a way of life for him. So that was a very profound lesson. And the other thing that I learned from Guy that was really interesting was that he was brutally honest in telling his story in his memoir. And so he would talk about all sorts of ethical temptations and failures and the greed that he felt in his early years as a sort of Gordon Gekko-like banker, and how tempting that was, and how he'd be jealous of various people who were billionaires and the like. And then he talked about sort of shifting from that way of seeing the world to be, really thanks to the example of Warren Buffett, to becoming a much more decent, much more honorable guy. And what was fascinating to me was that in writing extremely honestly and candidly in his book, he kind of struck this chord where I think, readers just saw that he had tremendous integrity and authenticity. And so the book has done incredibly well, but not just in terms of sales, although it's done very well in terms of sales, but he's received well over 1,000 emails and letters from people saying how much the book had touched them and affected their lives. And that to me was very powerful, this idea that if you're actually honest and have integrity and authenticity, even in talking about your flaws and your failings and your mistakes, that resonates somehow with people, and it's better than actually just making a sales pitch and saying, look how fantastic I am, and pretending that you're somehow flawless.
That seems like a very rare trait in somebody like a world-famous hedge fund investor.
I think it's difficult, but he and his friend Monish Pabrai, who's another famous hedge fund manager, take this idea very seriously. And part of it stems from reading a book called Power versus Force, which had big influence on both of them, which has this idea that you kind of vibrate at a higher level in some way if you're honest. And so Monish also has this sense that he's just going to tell the truth. And so Monish had a terrible time during the financial crisis where, you know, his fund went down something like 70%. And he said, I just told the truth to my investors. I said, you know, it didn't go down because the market got killed. It went down because I made this mistake, and this mistake. And he said almost nobody bailed out of his fund. So he said, really what people care about is that you treat them honestly. So to me, that's a very profound and kind of thought-provoking idea.
Well, let's dive a little more into your most recent book, The Great Minds of Investing, which is just an incredibly beautiful and profound book itself.
Thank you.
Why did you want to write the profiles for this book?
One of the things that's always fascinated me is that there's this small elite of investors that manage to beat the market typically over quite a long period. And I was always fascinated by the idea of what do they have? What have they figured out? What enables them to win this very difficult game? That in some way they're defying gravity by they're sort of beating the odds because it's so difficult to beat the market. And so that requires a certain set of skills, a different type of temperament, different ideas that I find really fascinating. But then over the years, my interest in these people kind of deepened, I think. Probably as I encountered all sorts of existential angst as a middle-aged man, I started to think, well, so what's it all about? What am I supposed to learn about life? And so one of the things that fascinates me is just looking at these people kind of as repositories of tremendous practical wisdom and thinking, so what works? What's made them happy? What's made them fulfilled? What do they regret when they look back on their lives? You know, what's given meaning to their life? How have they dealt with adversity? How have they balanced work and family? All of these things. And so for me, one of the great pleasures of the book was that I had this set of extraordinary people that I could quiz not just about how they beat the market and became rich, which is interesting but ultimately kind of a game, but also how do they make sense of their lives and what can we learn from them about how to live our own lives.
There are many, many stories within the book, but overall, what big idea do you want people to come away with after putting down the book?
To me personally, one of the most fascinating discoveries was that none of these guys had had straight upward trajectories where life was just always simple, they were always going to do great, and it was all going to be hunky-dory. I think pretty much all of them have suffered periods of tremendous adversity, partly because that's just the way life is, but partly I think because these guys tend to be iconoclasts and mavericks. They don't follow the crowd. They go their own way. And so sometimes they're just massively sort of out of sync with the market, out of sync with, bubbles. So suddenly everyone is making a fortune off a tech bubble or an internet bubble or an emerging market stock bubble. And these guys are going their own way and they look like morons for years in a row. But also then they go through things where, they have health crises or they have business crises or, personal crises. And so what fascinated me really was how they deal with adversity. This is one of many themes in the book, but I was fascinated by where they drew their strength from when they were going through the ringer. Because I think all of us at some point go through the ringer. It's just the nature of existence. And so one of the stories that fascinated me was a legendary investor called Bill Miller, who for 15 years running had beaten the market with this huge mutual fund in Baltimore and had become really kind of the most famous of all mutual fund managers, and then just had this appalling time in 2008 where the two mutual funds he ran kind of virtually collapsed and 90% of the assets in his funds fled. And I was fascinated by the way Miller had dealt with this crisis and at the same time had gone through a divorce and lost 80% of his own money. And he turned to Stoic philosophy, and so he had studied philosophy at Johns Hopkins as a teenager, and he turned to writers like Epictetus and Seneca, who were these great Stoics who would emphasize how you deal with suffering, and they would say it's not really what happens to you that matters, it's your attitude towards it. And he read Vice Admiral Stockdale's book about being tortured as a POW in Vietnam, and so I was fascinated by how these guys who seem on top of the world in many ways. I mean, even when everything went to hell during the financial crisis, so he had to sell his yacht, to buy new stocks. I mean, it's not like he was on the Bowery homeless.
Right.
But, he had over 100 people laid off because of mistakes that he made, and he had to deal with that. And I was fascinated by how these remarkable people have found strength during the difficult times in their lives. And I think that relates to all of us. We all need to figure out, where do you draw your strength when your career, when your family, or when your health, whatever it is, isn't as you wish it would be. I found most of them were really thoughtful, and they're highly intelligent, highly engaged people, and they have sort of omnivorous intellects, right? They're looking around, figuring out, what about this? How do I learn about this and this? And you look at someone like Charlie Munger, who, I think his kids once described him as a book on legs. He's just constantly reading. And so, to me, also they're kind of practical philosophers in some way, because they're dealing with the flux of markets and economies and industries and companies. And so they're actually having to adapt to kind of a very dynamic world that's constantly changing. And so it's not like an academic who's, sitting in his study at Oxford or Harvard trying to figure out, yes, well, this is, how I think the world operates. Someone like Howard Marks, who's one of the most brilliant guys I interviewed, is managing $93 billion. And so in the midst of the financial crisis, he was investing $500 million a week, betting that he was right. So when he's, drawing on what he learned as a student at Wharton, which is all about Japanese philosophy and flux and the fact that everything is constantly in flux, it's not just an intellectual argument. It's like he's got billions of dollars riding on his sense that nothing in life is permanent.
Who should read this book?
I think anyone who's interested in investing would get something out of it, but I'd like to think that because I have these idiosyncratic interests myself, it appeals to people who aren't just trying to accumulate wealth. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to accumulate wealth. We're all trying to support ourselves and set aside money for retirement and send our kids to college and the like. But I really saw it as an opportunity to ask these people about deeper questions. And so I'm not trying to hit people over the head in the book with this. I think you have to work a bit to draw these lessons from the profiles. But I think if you're a sensitive reader, you read about someone like Howard Marks dealing with the financial crisis and uncertainty. And it really raises important questions about how you deal with uncertainty in your life. Or if you deal with someone else talking about, their regrets with their family or something like that. It makes you think about these much deeper issues. So I'd like to think that it's of interest to anybody who's fascinated by highly successful people and who feels like there's something that you can kind of reverse engineer from these people.
What would you say, while writing the profiles or interviewing these folks, was the most surprising story that was shared with you?
One of the people I really found kind of mesmerizing was Monish Pabrai, the investor I mentioned before, who's a self-made Indian investor based in Irvine, California. And I spent about 6 hours interviewing him in Irvine. And Monish has this fascinating idea that really all of the great ideas are out there already, and you don't need to have any original thoughts or ideas in life at all, and you can kind of just clone and mimic what other people have done. And he's very funny about this. He describes himself as a shameless copycat. And about 20 years ago, he started as an investor. Basically, this game he launched was to turn $1 million into $1 billion by compounding at 26% a year over 30 years. And he said that all he did was study Buffett obsessively and then say, these are the laws of investing as set down by Warren Buffett, and now I'm just going to clone them mercilessly. And that to me is a really fascinating and kind of intellectually thrilling idea. It's kind of provocative, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you don't need to be that original. We tend to lionize, and probably rightly, anyone who has really original, wonderful breakthrough ideas. But Monish's idea, there was something kind of subversively pleasing about it. The idea that actually what you should be doing is figuring out who should I clone, who should I mimic, who's already figured out how to do this well. And that to me is a really fascinating idea, because actually it applies to any of us, and so whatever profession we might be in. So really what I should be doing is figuring out, how did Malcolm Gladwell become so great? How did Michael Lewis become so great? Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I guess many of us don't approach those larger goals in our career because we do feel like we have to reinvent that wheel to make a difference.
Yeah, and the truth is that we all at some level are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? In every area, we're benefiting from things that people figured out before. And so I think kind of consciously having that mindset of thinking, what did these guys already figure out that I need to adopt in my own life? I think it's a very powerful and important lesson, actually. Yeah. So in some strange way, there's something radically original about this idea of being totally unoriginal and just cloning other people.
What advice did these extraordinarily hard workers offer you about work-life family balance?
I spent a few hours interviewing a famous older investor called Jean-Marie Eveillard, who's now retired. And he was really extraordinarily candid and said to me when I asked him what his regrets were in life, he basically said that he wasn't sure he'd been that great a father. And he said that investing was so absorbing and so psychologically demanding that he'd pretty much neglected his two daughters in much the same way that his parents had neglected him when he was growing up in France. And I said to him, do you think you could have been as great an investor as you were and actually been a really great father as well? And he said, I don't know. I don't know. And I thought that was really interesting and really honest, a kind of a painful admission that it's not easy. If you want to be really excellent at something, there sometimes is a price for the people closest to you. And then I interviewed a remarkable investor, a guy called Donald Ackman, who manages about $30 billion and at one point was actually a Mormon bishop for 5 years. He's a very unusual guy. He has 7 kids, about 30 grandkids, and has been married for nearly 50 years. And he said to me that one of his teachers in the Mormon church had said that there's that no amount of success can compensate for failure at home. And he said that he'd taken that very seriously to heart. And during a time in his career that was incredibly hard, he said where he virtually lost control of his fund because his board members decided that he wasn't investing the way he ought to, and they were totally and utterly wrong. But it took tremendous strength to keep to the program that he had charted in the first place. He said that it had helped him tremendously that he had other interests, that he cared more about his family, he cared more about his church, he cared more about being a scout leader and the like than about just being incredibly successful financially and professionally. And I think that's a profound idea that to be tremendously successful professionally but to have it at the cost of your family, is that really success? I think it's a powerful question that we should probably all be asking.
What was your favorite piece of advice given by Warren Buffett, and why?
One of the things Buffett has often said, which I think is very important, very profound, even though it sounds quite simple, is that if you hang out with people who are better than you, you can't help but improve. And I think this whole idea that even the circle of friends that you choose, the people you hang out with at work, these things really matter because, as he said at one point, if you hang out with people who are really kind of lousy, at some point it kind of drags you down. Yeah. And I think the impact of your environment, your social environment, is very important, but also the people you work with. So I think that's important. And one of the things Charlie Munger said, which is really interesting, is that you can hang out with the eminent dead, was his phrase. And so Munger was very influenced by people like Ben Franklin. And so really this question of who you hang out with, you can define it very loosely. I mean, it can be a mentor, it can be your colleagues, it can be your friends, but it can actually also be who you read about, who you study. And so I think not all of us have an opportunity to have, great mentors or great bosses, but in a way, you go to the library or the bookstore and you can read about Ben Franklin, you can read about Buffett, you can read about Munger, and you can, and in a sense, you're hanging out with people who are better than you by doing that, and I'm speaking for myself, and learn from them.
Investing has become so machine-driven. Everything is so automated, and I think it's so interesting that at this point in time you step back and you really delve deeply into these personalities who were really laying the foundation at some point for modern investing. Why is this important for us to revisit right now?
I think there are very powerful principles that some of these guys embody. And if you look, say, at Ben Graham, who was Buffett's teacher, there are really extraordinary pieces of wisdom that he embodied, like this idea of the margin of safety, which was one of the most important lessons that he handed down to Buffett, which is this idea that, you know, instead of gunning for maximum profits in life, trying to become as rich as fast as possible, you know, you need always to build in a margin of safety. And that applies to everything. You know, it applies when you're driving, it applies when you're saving for retirement, when you're saving money for a rainy day because of health concerns, whatever. And so to me, these guys embody a kind of tremendous sort of practical wisdom and knowledge that you can draw on and learn from, that, you know, an algorithm that you use to trade isn't going to have. One of the most interesting guys I interviewed was Irving Kahn, who died at 109 a few months ago. And Irving Kahn had actually been he'd been a teaching assistant to Ben Graham in the 1920s, and Irving had lived through just incredible tumult. He started investing in 1929 during the crash of 29. He lived through the Great Depression. He lived through World War II. He lived through Vietnam, all these crises. And I said to him, you know, what's the single most important piece of financial advice you can share? And he said, safety. You need to look at the downside. You need to consider the downside before any possibility that you can make profits and get rich. And so I think some of these guys have this kind of worldly wisdom that enabled them to survive through 60, 70, 80 years of turmoil. And that's something that no computer really can give you yet.
Who was the most unconventional of the subjects you interviewed?
Possibly Arnold Vandenberg, who's someone I admire tremendously, who's a lesser-known investor based in Texas, who just has the most riveting life story. He was born in 1939 as a Jewish kid in Amsterdam. He was actually born on the same street as Anne Frank. And for the first couple of years of his life, he was hidden. And then at some point, his parents made the excruciating decision that they needed to get him out of the house, because if the Nazis came in and searched for him, and searched for anyone, and he made a noise, they would all be killed. And so a 19-year-old girl who didn't know the family at all actually risked her life to sneak him out of the house, across Amsterdam, into an orphanage outside the city. And he said for many years he wrestled with what on earth would possess some total stranger to risk her life to save him. And he said many years later he was talking to a psychiatrist when he was an adult, and the guy said, well, that's easy. He said, you know, for some people their life matters more than their values, and for other people their values matter more than their life. And he was like, oh yeah, now I get it. And he had decided that he was going to live his life very much in a sort of very values-driven way. And he just had this extraordinary life where his parents were both sent to Auschwitz, and they actually both survived, and they came and picked him up from the orphanage when he was 6 years old. He couldn't recognize them anymore, and he couldn't walk at that point. He was basically just crawling because he was so malnourished. And they left Holland and went to live in Los Angeles in a very rough community, and he was beaten up a lot. And so he started just with this incredibly unlikely sort of origin story. There was no way this guy was going to become a famous or successful money manager. And he said to me, you know, I wasn't even smart. He's like, my parents and my teachers thought that I had brain damage because I'd been so malnourished. And he had this extraordinary transformation through the course of his life where he kind of really, because he became obsessed with the idea of the subconscious and of controlling your mind, and of all these ideas about the importance of your consciousness. That was sort of key to him. And so he transformed his life really by taking control of his mind. And so that to me was an absolutely fascinating story. And now, you know, he's in his 70s, manages $1.6 billion, has 40 employees. And he's just this lovely man, but also this tremendous inspiration. And so I think his journey, not from, you know, Harvard Business School to, you know, Fidelity, but from, you know, Anne Frank Street to, you know, via his parents being in Auschwitz to being a successful money manager, was just kind of mesmerizing and riveting, and gives you a sense that, you know, really, you know, as David Khalili would tell me, anything is possible. That, you know, if you put your mind to it, you can achieve extraordinary things.
Marty Whitman makes a very candid confession about a big mistake he made. First of all, how did you get him to make that confession? And tell us a little bit about that story.
I said to Marty, you know, you didn't really handle the financial crisis well, and not only didn't you handle the financial crisis well, but then the rebound afterwards, you didn't really handle that well. And I said, how come? Like, given the strength of your ideas, given how smart you are, given how robust your ideas are, I don't get why you didn't do better. And it was a question based on the fact that actually I knew a lot about Marty Whitman, and so I was able to ask him this kind of impertinent question that wasn't just impertinent. It was like I was wrestling with what on earth happened. And he happens to be a very honest and direct guy. And he said to me, you know, he said, as I got older and richer, I became lazier. And he said, I kind of took my eye off the ball. And he said, I owned housing-related stocks and insurance-related stocks going into the financial crisis in 2008. And he said, I kind of thought about selling, and I never got around to it. And it was an incredibly candid, honest admission. And to me, a really powerful reminder of just how difficult this profession is. You know, to be a great investor, you've got to be full on. And he was in his 80s at that point, if I remember rightly. And I think, you know, he was slowing down a bit, and he had been an extraordinary investor. And you know, he's a very brilliant man. He's written incredible books. And Bill Nygren, who's another very well-known investor, said to me that often great investors decide that they're going to slow down and they're going to semi-retire sort of as they get old. And he said it's always a disaster. He said, you know, it's such a difficult profession that he said there's no dimmer switch, was his phrase. He said either the light is fully on or it's fully off. You can't do it halfway. And I think that's the case in many professions. It's certainly the case in writing. It's so difficult. The craft is so difficult. The economics of the business is so difficult. Unless you're really determined, you know, you're unlikely to succeed at it. So I think it was a powerful reminder that you need to have this kind of intensity. And all of these people who've been very successful in the book, it's not an accident. They have tremendous drive and determination. And Whitman himself, you know, he'd started off in the 1920s. He said to me that his family was so poor that you had to think twice before you bought a pretzel for 1 cent or 2 cents, because his parents had a tiny one-person, two-person business where they provided the felt hats. And so, you know, he'd risen through incredible drive and determination and intelligence. And, you know, you need that to succeed in these professions.
Why does Thomas Gaynor live so modestly?
Gaynor's a really interesting guy. Gaynor is a very well-known investor who manages the investment portfolio at this big insurance company, Markel. And he lives in Virginia in a relatively modest townhouse. He drives a Toyota Prius. And, you know, I talked to him a lot about this whole issue of money, and he explained that he'd grown up Quaker and then later became Episcopalian, and he just has this very modest view of how he should live. He's very keen on giving money to charity, but he's not a self-righteous sort of sanctimonious guy. He said, you know, look, believe me, I'm not living like Mother Teresa. You know, so he's funny about this, but you really get the sense that he understands that money and flash possessions and the like are not really going to make him happy. And he's been married to the same person for, I think, 33 years, and he has 3 kids who he described to me as normal and enjoyable. And he says, you know, he's just totally blessed. And one of the really interesting things to me, I asked pretty much everyone in the book that I interviewed about money and what money meant to them and what it had bought them and what it really didn't buy them. And Monish Pabrai again said to me that he agreed with Charlie Munger, who said that really what money buys you is independence. You know, the independence to say what you think, to do what you think, not really to be a slave to anyone else. And I think that's a kind of profound idea. It's not really about the Ferraris and the Porsches and the Maseratis. You know, those toys are fine if that's what turns you on, but they provide pretty ephemeral pleasure. So I'm not trying to be moralistic about it, but there were certain people in the book who, like Gaynor, who were more modest and more philanthropic, for example, and they had a kind of glow to them. Certainly Gaynor did. There's a wonderful guy called John Spears, who I interviewed, who also, you know, had this tremendous glow about him. And they tended to be people who weren't that flashy. They weren't that turned on by the private jets and stuff. I also think that if you're really motivated by the money, it's quite difficult to to succeed over 30, 40, 50 years, because at a certain point that the passion kind of wanes a little bit. And so I think for some of these guys, the fact that they had an end beyond, private jets kind of really helped. And so Monish Pabrai, for example, I think he sent 196 kids to the Indian equivalent of MIT. And so he's really transforming these kids' lives. And he said, when he gets to a point where he's educated something like 15, 20,000 of these kids, he said, we'll change the trajectory of India. And there's a tremendous sense of joyfulness to him when he talks about that. And, it's not like he's living in an impoverished way, but he'll often say that he'd like to be remembered for this charity, Dakshana, that he runs in India rather than, for his hedge fund.
Why are ugly stocks so attractive to Bruce Greenwald?
Yeah, Bruce is a character. Bruce is very funny. People fall in love with whatever's faddish, whatever's popular, and so as a result, they overpay for stuff that, like it might be, Tesla, right? So Tesla is a really beautiful car, and it seems to be doing great, and we all know that, we need a better solution in terms of energy. And so Tesla suddenly becomes popular, and then it becomes crazily expensive. And the same happened with tech stocks in the late 90s, internet stocks. And so what great value investors tend to do is they look at stuff that's totally unloved, that's ugly, that's unattractive, that everybody else is neglecting. And they say, well, look, this is mispriced because nobody cares about it, nobody values it. And so it requires a certain type of independence of spirit, independence of mind to think that way. You have to not really care what other people think about you because, the crowd is all running off in this direction, and there's, this one guy on this side saying, no, honestly, I really love this stock that everyone else thinks is going to go bankrupt. Now, that requires a degree of kind of subversive independence that I think some of the great value investors have. And it's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to the value investors, because they question everything. They don't look at things the way everyone else sees things. So to me, in some ways, value investing is a question of how to make money and how to win the game. But in some ways, it's really a deeper philosophical thing. It's how do you see the world? Do you want to be the same as everybody else, or do you want to question things in a freer way, be true to yourself, be more independent thinking? And so I kind of see investing at two levels. Like there's this very practical side of investing, and there's this side of investing that's really quite philosophical, that's about how you see the world. And I think people like Bruce are these great kind of iconoclasts who see the world very differently.
How does Bill Ackman incorporate this sort of save the world idealism into his investment work?
Ackman's a fascinating guy. Ackman is what's known as an activist investor, right, where he is prepared to agitate to make things change. And it requires a certain type of person to do this type of investing. You have to not care if people dislike you. Whitman described it to me as pain in the arse investing, where you just have to be willing for people to dislike you. And Ackman's fascinating because he has this brilliant mind. He's a superb analyst, but he's also kind of combative. In 2012, he made $1 billion bet that this company, Herbalife, would go broke, that the stock would go down and ultimately would go broke. And he invested something like $50 million in investigating the company, claiming that it was a fraud that was preying on poor people, disadvantaged people in about 90 different countries. A lot of people disagree with him, but Ackman has this kind of righteous indignation and a desire to sort of, avenge wrongs. There's something of the investigative journalist in Ackman, and he's a brilliant analyst. And so he sort of applied this to this situation where his fund can make an enormous amount of money if he's right, but at the same time he's correcting a wrong if he's correct that it's a fraud. And so I think, at some level you have to figure out who you are as an investor. As in any other field, you've got to figure out, do I really want to be fighting with people? Do I want to be accusing people of being fraudsters? Do I want to be in lawsuits and having people insult me in the media and say that I'm one of his main rivals described him as a crybaby on CNBC and a loser and stuff like that. And you have to decide, do I want to live my life that way? I said to Ackman, just reading about you, reading these news clips, I become tired. It's exhausting to me. And he's like, no, I'm hardly ever in a lawsuit. And so it just, it suits his personality. So I think, one of the keys with investing is first you have to know yourself. You've got to figure out, do I really want to act that way? And one of the things that Guy Spear said to me is, he's a huge admirer of Bill Ackman and his friends Bill Ackman, but he just figured out I'm not going to short any stocks. I don't want to bet that things are going wrong. I don't want to wish for bad things to happen. And he just thinks comically it's not good, that you kind of want to be betting that things are going to be okay, not that they're going to fall apart. And, they're both really good guys. They're both really smart. And they, at some level, they're both right. It's just horses for courses. You have to figure out what suits you.
What did Joel Greenblatt tell you about exploring off the beaten path?
Yeah, Greenblatt's a remarkable guy. He's one of the most successful investors in the book, but he's also remarkable in multiple ways in that he's written enormously successful books. He's been an extraordinary philanthropist. He's very much at the vanguard of charter schools. He's got 5 kids. He's a very larger-than-life character. And in his early days as a hedge fund manager, what he did was he would put almost all of his money in 6 or 8 stocks, which is an incredibly risky thing to do, except that he understood them better than anyone else. And he would focus on companies that were really off the beaten path, that were typically tiny, often had liquidity constraints. So they were the sort of thing that other people weren't looking at. And the advantage of this is just that when you're looking away from what the herd is looking at, from what the crowd is looking at, you find these anomalies, these things that are just mispriced. And there are millions of people looking at a company like Apple. We basically know more or less what the products are and what its prospects are. It's hard to predict the future in any technology business, but it's a very well-covered business that's followed by a lot of incredibly smart people. It's hard to add value. What people like Greenblatt would do, at least in those days, was to look at stuff that almost nobody followed, because then you're using your intelligence to see what other people have missed. And so this is part of what I was saying before, that it's a game, and you've kind of got to figure out what your edge is.
So what's next for you as journalist extraordinaire? Another book?
I'm still really deeply fascinated with this question I explored in this book, The Great Minds of Investing, which is what are you supposed to learn both about investing, but more important about life, from these remarkable people? And in this book, because the profiles were relatively short, I didn't get to develop some of these ideas as deeply as I would like to. And so I think what I'm going to do in my next book is explore those questions much more deeply. And I think there are certain people that I talk to in this book, and also that I've interviewed elsewhere or want to interview, that are very remarkable, and I'd like to kind of go deeper into those questions, because at some level what I'm trying to figure out in all of these interviews is how am I supposed to live? Like, how am I supposed to make sense of my own life? What am I supposed to do? How do I become more successful? How do I balance work and family? How do I deal with my own failures and setbacks and fears and doubts and all of that? And so I'm fascinated by this idea of how you take these remarkable people and kind of reverse engineer them and figure out what to apply in your own life. And so I feel like more to be done in that direction, and I'd like to go deeper into those questions.
I will look forward to that. This is Sartor TV. I'm Jennifer Crumpton. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.